Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn Kaza with Everbridge, and thanks for joining this afternoon. Today we'll take a look back on several critical events that took place in 2021 and understand the human element behind them. Then we'll look at the threat landscape for 2022 and offer recommendations on how to mitigate risk. Our speaker today is Steve Cremando, Principal and Founder of Behavioral Science Applications. He is a consultant and educator focused on the human element in disasters, mass violence, and other traumatic events. Mr. Cremando is a certified threat manager, a certified homeland protection professional, and a board-certified expert in traumatic stress. Before we begin, I have a couple housekeeping items. We'll be recording the session and making it available on demand after today. Also, we'll be accepting audience questions and we'll try to answer a few of them at the end of the session. If we're unable to get to your question, we will be sure to have someone follow up with you directly. All right, let's jump into the presentation. Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Jocelyn, and thanks everyone for making time today to be part of this program. Please keep in mind, any questions or ideas for discussion towards the end. We're happy to make time to answer those or try to entertain any sorts of ideas that you may have on this topic as well. Certainly none of us have the ability to completely forecast or predict what's coming next on the horizon, especially when we think about the current threat landscaping being so really complex and dynamic. But one thing that's very, very notable in the current landscape is the fact that most of the concerns we have really are somewhat people-centric. There's a lot that really have to do with people's behavior, and that'll be the focus of our discussion today. So we'll be looking pretty much through the lens of what's referred to as operational psychology. Operational psychology is the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical or their operational value. Here, taking this quote from David McIntyre's very well-known set of textbooks in emergency management, he had said that speaking to audiences like ours today, you must understand human behavior better than anyone else in the community. It's not the job of the social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and so forth to understand how people will behave in crisis conditions, but it is ours. So this, what we're talking about psychology is not a discussion at all about the assessment, diagnosis, or treatment of any sorts of mental health conditions. It's really kind of not the realm of people who are counselors or clinicians. This is very specifically us understanding human behavior that we've seen over the last year and human behavior we anticipate on the horizon from kind of a behavioral standpoint. So as we think about that, we're going to talk about those kind of critical events today that are most sensitive to human behavior. There are lots of things going on, obviously. There's a really significant disruption, as you know, of the supply chain. That's not as sensitive to human behavior. There are other sorts of homeland threats on the horizon. We anticipate potentially more use of drones in the coming year and going forward for different sorts of attack scenarios. Not, again, particularly sensitive to human behavior in the same way as some of the threats that we'll be talking about today. So we're going to focus really on 5 different areas and kind of drill down in terms of where we've been and where we're going from a behavioral standpoint. I'm going to talk about public health emergencies kind of in general and the pandemic more specifically, talk about the role of kind of behavior in cyber threats, the changing and shifting dynamics around extremism and terrorism right now, but also crowd behavior and civil unrest. And then we're going to talk about combined some issues that relate to workplace and school violence. All of these are things that have been somewhat on our collective minds over the last several weeks, months, and throughout the year. So, hopefully we could see these as timely. And I actually would suggest they're going to remain very timely going into 2022 and in the near term, perhaps beyond that. So not that any of those other sorts of threats are not equally as important, but these are several that really lend themselves to a discussion of the human element. And things I think that very often, because we're speaking about human behavior, are not necessarily discussed around our conference rooms and our meeting tables when we do start to talk about anticipating different threats and how to mitigate them. So the launch pad for our discussion today is Lewin's equation. And if you're not familiar, Dr. Kurt Lewin is thought to be the father of social psychology, had very famously said that human behavior is a function of the interaction between the person and their environment. Now, we cannot say, with any certainty what 7.8 billion different people on the planet are likely to think or do at any given moment, but we can say with a higher degree of confidence in what sort of environments, what sort of situations are we likely to see people engage or not engage in different sorts of behaviors that have a meaning, really meaningful sort of use for us when we think about policies and plans, procedures during emergencies and disasters, tabletops and other forms of exercises. Are we getting the people piece of this right? When we don't, it actually could leave our plans, our policies, our procedures ineffective, that they're really not doing what they ought to do. It could lead to possibly dangerous behavior in terms of ourselves through our plans and policies escalating a situation if we don't understand human behavior in the most accurate way we can. So we'll apply this idea, Lewin's kind of overarching idea throughout our program as we start thinking about really what people are most likely to do in these 5 threat scenarios going forward in 2022, as well as we are. When we think just, to kind of move forward from Lewin's equation about that one element, the environment though is not just isolated to one current event going on. If you think about where we've been in 2021, record wildfire season up and down the West Coast, record-setting storm season in the Gulf Coast and other parts of the country, ongoing civil unrest here in the States and around the world, and obviously the pandemic as a backdrop globally to all those things going on. At the same time, we've been in a very, very tense political and social environment, a very challenging media environment. All of these things coming together, this is what forms the environment. It's not just the one thing. So you do have to be, of course, very, I believe, on top of current events, watching how people are behaving, getting a sense of public sentiment, your employees' reactions, all those things for us to have an accurate view about how people may behave, because it's typically not just in response to the one thing, but the combination of all these different sorts of actions going on simultaneously that create the environment that people are reacting to. Now, from a behavioral science standpoint, the current environment, especially around pandemic, is one that we would refer to as a VUCA event. And you can see here that VUCA is an acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And if we think about the pandemic, it certainly contains all of those elements, if for no other reason, because pandemics are predictably unpredictable. The nature of the virus is always changing. The nature of governmental response, and I mean that in the widest way I can, meaning governments worldwide, and the way people, individuals, conduct themselves, whether they choose to vaccinate or mask or social distance or comply with other sorts of recommendations. All of those things converge in a way that ultimately dictate the trajectory of the pandemic event, but they're not necessarily knowable in any given moment. And as I said, without reading you each of these, these boxes, the pandemic contains these 4 elements, and we actually, creates for us a tremendously uncertain sort of landscape. Now, for our standpoint, applying these kind of behavioral science ideas, uncertainty, we understand, is the key driver of anxiety. Fear is our response to what's happening now. Anxiety is our response to what we're concerned will happen next. And that's, usually unknowable. Just human nature is such that we do better with what we know, even if it's bad news, than the unknown. So this is, unfortunately, an ongoing risk environment that's characterized, if nothing else, by uncertainty, which is likely to keep stress levels and tension just at a very, very high level. And you would have to kind of admit, I believe, to ourselves that people are very tense right now. People are on edge, and we're seeing a lot of different ways that's been manifested or acted upon over the last 12 months. And certainly some of that is not going to respect necessarily the change in the calendar, and very likely will bleed into 2022 as well. So hold on to this idea of a VUCA event, and it's useful for planning other sorts of emergency response as well, but certainly is very characteristic of where we are at the moment. The other things we know is that when we think about the drivers of stress, all kinds of stress, the two primary drivers that we're concerned about are the duration of the event and the intensity of the event. And the pandemic, again, by its very nature, are very intense and very long emergencies. When we get into those realms where we're really operating in long-term emergency scenarios, it does create some significant changes in people's behavioral response. As I mentioned before, not only are we not very well suited to deal with uncertainty, we're also not very well suited to deal with long-term chronic stress. We do, acute stress very well. Sudden, shocking events, we really kind of can rally our resources internally, organizationally, societally, and deal with those things. When we get into these long-term crises that are very, very intense, we know that that has a different sort of effect on us, not one that's particularly helpful, because as I mentioned, we're not really well suited for chronic stress in the way we are for more acute stresses. Now, these are some general ideas that are going to inform our discussion of the 2022 landscape. And there's lots of other ideas, that we could take from the behavioral sciences that are useful in understanding the current environment and projecting where we're going into the next year. But the current environment is very, very complex and very, very challenging. And, it's defined by a number of factors, not just the pandemic, but the pandemic is certainly one that's very dominant. Social, political, economic instability, the markets, prices of commodity, the supply chain, all have been incredibly volatile. And it's really shaken people's belief in the stability of really just everyday life around us, as well as belief in our authorities and our leaders and our neighbors, our coworkers and our organizations. All of that's been very, very badly shaken. And it probably will take some time to really restore. Now, we're going to talk about some of the models of where we're going behaviorally, but I will tell you this. Pandemics, as we know them, and public health emergencies more broadly, cast a very long behavioral shadow. So even when the pandemic or COVID-19 starts to abate, and we hear lots of theorists say, well, we may not totally lose COVID-19, it may become more endemic than a pandemic. At some point, the pandemic itself, it does end, even though we may still have COVID as a background sort of threat to us as a yearly or an ongoing sort of health hazard. But regardless of how that shakes out, the behavioral consequences of where we've been and where we're going in the near term, they're going to continue probably for about 3 to 5 years, if not for a decade. So the behavioral piece really just kind of kicks into gear when the virus threat starts to diminish. And this creates, really the idea that we will have an ongoing complex and dynamic landscape throughout the current year and well into the next year as well. Now, part of that, as I said, with the pandemic being one of the dominant themes for the 21 and 22 prediction and landscape is really the idea of pandemic fatigue. And pandemic fatigue is actually a little more complex than we're all just really tired of this and we've had enough and we want this to be over and we want life to go back to the way it was before March of 2020 when the pandemic jumped off. Really, it's like a physiological basis as well, because when we were all first thrust into responding to the pandemic in March of 2020, certainly many of us were glued to our newscasts and keeping tabs on really the count every day of how many cases and hospitalizations and casualties, and we were paying great attention to it. And as I said, it was all very new to us, and we really rallied, and we rallied physiologically as well. Whether we realized it or not, our heart rates are up, our blood pressures are up, muscle tension is up, and so forth. But for us to continue to operate at that level of concern and stress, things have to change. And one of the things that changes is we slowly begin to acclimate to that, what some people might refer to as a new normal, at least physically or physiologically. We start to habituate to it. And habituating lets us kind of get back to our business as much as we can, recognizing that this threat is still in the background, probably not realizing as much that our brains and our bodies are still running in alert mode. And over time, this really starts to wear us down. And in some ways that are not particularly good for our physical health, our mental health, our job performance, and so forth. And that's kind of what pandemic fatigue is about. It's more than just kind of being tired. As I said, this creates for us a chronic stress environment where we're not really operating as well as we can, and which takes a greater toll on us over time. But we do kind of adjust to it so we all can go on. Bottom line is, it's still taking its toll. And that toll, we may not fully appreciate for a few years to come. So in that way, one of the ways we start thinking about the behavioral consequences of the pandemic before we move on to some of those other topics like civil unrest and cybersecurity and so forth, is just thinking about where people are right now with their mental health. If we were having this discussion before the pandemic jumped off in March of 2020, I would have said to you that the prevalence of mental illness in the United States was about 18%, 18.6%. It was about 1 out of every 5 people. Revised statistics from Johns Hopkins tell us that is now actually more than 1 in 4 people. It's about 26%. About 1 in every 4 Americans at this point has a diagnosable mental health disorder. Doesn't mean that they've been diagnosed, doesn't mean they're acknowledging it, doesn't mean that they're in treatment for it, but actually would meet the diagnostic criteria for one of the documented or one of the established mental health disorders. Beyond that, just about 50% of Americans surveyed by the American Psychological Association report a significant deterioration in their mental health since the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see the graphic alongside here that's about 53% of exhaustion, 53% of sadness in life, 50% more irritable, and all these different sorts of behavioral changes. And the other thing we noticed from this study, at least, is that it seems to affect the younger people in our population more significantly. So Gen X, Gen Z, some of our younger workers in the workforce actually experiencing greater levels of stress. If we were to jump for a moment to something like a specific sector like healthcare, we know that the numbers are even higher in healthcare, and that the younger workers, more than 75% of younger workers in healthcare feel completely burned out, and really about a quarter of them considering leaving the field. So you are hearing, these ideas of the great resignation and about people leaving their jobs early, retiring early, leaving the workforce altogether in some ways. A lot of that really does have to do with people's ability to respond to this unique sort of stress, which is I've painted for you, is unique in part because of its chronicity, of it just being such a long-term sort of event. Now, the other part of this that's very significant, as I said, is we are expecting that those mental health concerns actually escalate over the next 3 to 5 years. This graphic was created by the National Health Service in the UK, specifically the Center for Mental Health. In the US, this would be the correlate to SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration in Federal Health and Human Services. So this organization has been doing some forecasting, and what they believe is accurate is that the demand for mental health services, the need for mental health services, will escalate by about 2 to 3 times of what available capacity is to help folks in the 3 to 5 years after the pandemic trails off. So regardless of how you slice this, there's consensus in the behavioral sciences that the mental health consequences are actually just beginning. And that will affect stress levels. And again, at an operational level, we know that does have a significant consequence in job performance, as well as really physical and mental health. So all these things kind of are as a result of this very long and very complex emergency of the pandemic. Now, you have to appreciate that during the last great pandemic, 1918, 1919, a lot of the concepts we use in the behavioral sciences or mental health, they simply didn't exist at that time. If you take something, for example, like traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, We think about that very often in the wake of disasters and other crises today, but that whole idea really didn't arise until the end of the Vietnam War. So we don't have a really great roadmap, but we do have some, some lessons learned from other public health emergencies and other crises that are helping really researchers and leaders in these fields make these forecasts and make these sort of predictions for us. Now, the other thing that we know before we kind of start moving into these other risk categories is that when we have periods of time that are characterized by uncertainty, by economic disruption and economic loss, all of those kind of things really create fertile ground for conspiracy theories. And we have seen them in a very, very significant way over these few years, because what's new in the landscape of conspiracies is really the internet. It's our cellular devices, it is our social media platforms, and all the ways we communicate today. So there's always been periods of time where there's been greater activity around conspiracy theories, as I say, usually when there's times of instability, but their ability for people to communicate and the echo chamber effect of being in certain, social media platforms and so forth really have, I guess, been conspiracy theories on steroids, for a lack of better term, this time around compared to previous times in recent history. Now, one of the things before we move off this, other than noticing that there's more conspiracy theories, is really to note two really, I guess, constant factors or likely factors in conspiracy theories. And the first is a paranoid sort of quality, that somebody, someone, some organization is involved in nefarious activity, and it's something that's going to harm people, it's going to harm the democracy, it's going to harm our health or us financially. There's people out there or forces that are doing these harmful things, and they need to be stopped. And the need to be stopped part of it actually formulates into a grievance that people who subscribe to these conspiracies very often are angry at the things that are being done by all these, imagined or, however they perceive them, different actors or forces that are involved in these dangerous activities, and they need to be stopped. And that creates for us, unfortunately, this grievance that can be the entryway to the pathway to violence. Now, that violence can be, a one-off sort of event. It could be large-scale collective violence, such as riots or other behavior. But we know that the environment at the moment, if we take the constellation of all the things I've shared with you so far, is, for lack of a better term, a grievance-rich environment. There are so many different forms of grievance right now. So when we think about some of the increases in school violence, workplace violence, community violence that we've seen, noting, for example, that the murder rate in the United States is 30% higher year over year right now, that we're in some very, very tricky sort of situations, given all of these different elements coming together. Now, kind of wrapping up the pandemic piece, kind of bringing that back into perspective, we'll use that because it will be a thread through some of the other risks that I address over the next several moments. There will be ongoing spikes and surges and mutations. Obviously, the virus, that's the nature of the virus. It will keep the pandemic very much at the center of our discussions. Most of us, especially here in the US, recognize we're coming into a very divisive political election year, midterm election year, that's going to be very important, but also very, very fraught with emotion, with tension, with all sorts of behavioral challenges. So the emotional and socioeconomic fallout from the pandemic will be ongoing. It will stay distressing, it will stay disruptive, but it will actually be, more importantly, a force multiplier to all of the other potential stressors. I use this term here, if you're not familiar, to potentiate. In emergency medicine, for example, we would say if someone came into the emergency department, has overdosed on alcohol or the benzodiazepine, maybe something like Valium, the way these two substances interact actually magnifies the power of them. Well, the different sorts of stresses we have at the moment actually serve to potentiate each other and make them that much more powerful. So how the pandemic is managed or not managed, and people's perceptions about that, we know the perceptions are very varied and very powerful. They're going to continue to really shape a lot of how people think and behave going forward. Now, one of the silos here, and I know that when we think about IT, it's not really that siloed, because every function in our organization and probably in our personal lives today does have some dependency on IT, is we know that the human element is very, very sensitive and a very critical aspect of cybersecurity. In fact, research by Verizon and other organizations tell us that probably about 85% of all data breaches involve some aspect of the human element, and that could be an error, it could be an insider threat where someone does something malicious, but it's people. It's not systems necessarily, it's not flaws in code, and it's not flaws in the physical technology, but really the human interface and its human activity. Humans have always, people have always been seen as the weakest link in cybersecurity. And this weakness, this vulnerability, it actually gets exaggerated. It becomes made worse by kind of the ongoing stress and emotional disequilibrium that people are. And you think about disequilibrium, it's messages like everyone needs to come back to work in the office. Oh no, stop, we're not doing this again for another 3 months. We're back, we're forth in home and school, between hybrid learning, hybrid work, and so forth. There's a lot of things that are keeping people in disequilibrium. And the ongoing fears about people's health, their finances, the political backdrop, all creates distraction, which can lead to more cyber risk. Now, you would appreciate, and certainly imagine, that cyber criminals and would-be bad actors in the cyber environment, they get this. They understand that people are in increased time of vulnerability. If your head's not in the game, it's easy to make mistakes and be moving too quick. So hackers can really, and do seek to exploit these human vulnerabilities, especially in more stressful times. We know, again, all of the things going on: burnout, stress, disillusionment, all are forces psychologically that lead to cyber breaches. So when we think about this, going forward, the need to have those discussions between cybersecurity professionals and human resource professionals and other sorts of mental health professionals and maybe people in the EAP, they become that much more important, because here the human element will play an increasingly important role in cybersecurity when we know that people are just burned out. So I want to kind of leave you with this thought for a moment as we move away from the cyber area, which is, as stress increases, situational awareness decreases. So I'm not looking at little things on an email that may tell me that it's malicious. I may be moving so quick that I'm clicking on links I shouldn't. Vigilance decreases, but more importantly, executional errors increase. People make more mistakes. So cybersecurity is directly affected by these current sorts of dynamics, mostly stress. But you also could have employees who are angry and can act as, be some sort of insider threat, deliberately creating a cyber risk for your organization as well, because of the dynamics we're speaking about. So when we think about that, as I said, we know that through 2020, 2021, there's been increased cyber risk, in part because of people working home and attackers taking advantage of that. Right now, attackers are understanding the ongoing nature of chronic stress and how that's leaving people more vulnerable as well. And they're really seeking to very aggressively exploit that factor. It's something we need to be vigilant of. Now, from a Homeland Security standpoint, this is the most recent National Terrorism Advisory Bulletin from November 10th. And I'm taking this really right from the bulletin. Homeland continues to face a diverse and challenging threat environment, from individuals, from small groups, from domestic violent extremists, and we probably see more concern right now about international terrorism, especially in the wake of the wrap-up of U.S. activity in Afghanistan. So all of those are somewhat destabilizing. All those give rise to concerns about a reinvigorated Taliban and ISIS-K. So although domestic violent extremism from both the far right and far left have been the dominant threat over 2021, That has shifted late in 2021, and going into 2022, likely to be an equal concern from both domestic violent extremists and foreign terrorist sorts of organizations. So that kind of sand is shifting beneath us as well. Now, the other thing is, given the political environment and some very, very big, powerful court cases, judicial actions around abortion, around gun rights, things of this nature, are likely to stir up a lot of people in the domestic camps, whether it's far left or far right sorts of thinking. So we are in a place where both state and non-state actors, domestic and international actors, are promoting or propagandizing the need to take action, and understanding that nationally and even kind of in our business sector, we are at a state of vulnerability, which makes this makes us all a little bit softer in terms of being targets for these. Now, just thinking about some of the judicial actions I mentioned, thinking about the financial aspects of the crisis, think about things like just yesterday, the mayor of New York mandating now that all private sector employees as well as public sector employees will be mandated to vaccinate. We're going to continue to have people push back, a significant number of people. Again, have very strong feelings in both directions about the current environment around mandates and moderating our health situation. And so we have seen a very, very significant uptick in civil unrest and protests and crowd sort of behavior over the last several years. You see a 244% increase over, really the last several years. But the nature of, the topic and the energy has changed a lot in protests. Although not a discussion for today in depth, we've also seen a significant rise in the number of armed protests. We've seen protests in which vehicles have been used as weapons as well, things of this nature. So the nature of political unrest has changed, and the nature of risk inside political unrest has changed as well. If we look at just one time period from 2020, January 2020 specifically, to April 2021, we saw more than 5,000 pandemic-related violent events go on really worldwide. So to kind of summarize this, looking at this quote from Verisk Perspectives, we've entered a dangerous new era of civil unrest, both in the US and around the world. We are really on the front edge of some very potentially explosive collective actions as well as individual actions. So when we think about that, as I said, there is the societal damage that's done by that. There is certainly individual fears that are escalated, but there's also an economic, really the macroeconomic cost to areas that experience this. And we know that those places, those cities and those regions around the country and around the world that experience political unrest and civil unrest in this way actually see it manifest in economic downturn in the short run. We're talking about days and weeks after there have been riots or protests. So on one hand, we know that political or economic instability can feed civil unrest, but civil unrest actually creates economic instability as well. So this becomes somewhat of a vicious cycle. And you can see the figures underneath the graphic here. In 2020, about 15,000 documented acts of violent protests and riots around the world, resulting in about $15 trillion of damage that was done from that. So this is very significant on the 2022 landscape. Think again about the political environment, think about the health environment, think about all these things converging. And at the individual level, any one employee who is dealing with their own stresses, not just around work, but with what's going on in their home, their family, their own health concerns. And we know many people, even who have lived through COVID, meaning had been infected, did not fully recover. There's the concept of long COVID, and many people who are still struggling well after their initial experience with that. But back in the workplace, and we're going to talk about workplace and school kind of as our last real area of concern today, we know that stress, anxiety, and paranoia will continue to really influence employee behavior, client behavior, student behavior, everyone in these workplace and school environments. And those are changing kind of mandates and regulations about attendance to work, back and forth, and readjusting our daily routines. Very strong feelings on both sides of the discussion about feelings about vaccine or mandates, about masking, things of this nature. A lot of distrust of the, of messages of leaders, both in business and government and so forth. And potentially very significant and angry grievances towards employers. Think about people who may be losing jobs because they do not want to vaccinate. And maybe they feel, as many people in the healthcare sector do, that they were, they held in there through the worst of the pandemic. They were in the trenches helping their communities and their organizations, only to find themselves at risk of being fired because they feel they have a concern or disinclination perhaps to get vaccinated. So really, really tricky places we are. So let's think about this a little bit as we kind of close out this block and close out our presentation in a few moments. You've seen, as well as the constant stream of information about the pandemic, really a constant presence in our news cycle about workplace violence and mass shootings over the last 12 months now, and we believe, unfortunately, these are going to carry on into 2022. In fact, if we think about workplace violence, 3 of the 10 deadliest workplace, shootings in recorded history of, how we're tracking shootings, at least the last 40 years, they happened just in the first 6 months of 2021. And if we think about school violence, there's been 28 major incidents of school violence so far this year, and 20 of them have occurred since we reopened schools in September. So the reopening schools and the reopening the workplace has kind of in some ways demonstrated to us a lot of pent-up anger, a lot of pent-up proclivity towards violence that just has been suppressed by people schooling at home and working from home, but hasn't really gone away. So it's very important for organizations to be tightening up your policies, plans, procedures, your threat assessment capabilities, your thinking about violence assessment and response going into 2022, because just over the last 6 months, we've seen a really significant uptick in these numbers. Now, to kind of bring it back to, places we're more familiar, we think about active shooter incidents have been a very substantial upward trend for about the last decade. Just year over year, we saw a 20% increase going from 2019 to 2020, and we saw a 20% increase already going into the next, going into the new year, into 2021. So we have a very, very clear upward trend in this sort of violence, and this is carried, we see this being acted out, not just in gun violence, but all kinds of potential violent events. And as I said, at a macro level, we've seen increases in homicide rates, other sorts of violence. But that people are on edge, people are extremely tense, and you might even say explosive, where we've seen this increase in air rage, we've seen increases in assaults against people at school board meetings and all of these different sorts of places. And then a lot of that, and we see this in times when there's uncertainty, anger and violence gets projected at the other. And that may be what we've seen with the increase in violence directed towards the Asian American Pacific Islander community, LGBTQ plus communities, other communities, again, who have been at risk. We know we have seen upticks in violence, very notable upticks in those areas. So if we just take that, as I said, there's really positive, really powerful evidence in the workplace and schools of increased rates of violence and just hostile behaviors. I mean, if you look at this graphic with me from the Government Accountability Office, which is working with statistics from the U.S. Department of Education, we've seen this tremendous increase in violence, especially weapons violence in schools. Now, think about how much effort is going into anti-bullying campaigns, increasing active shooter response capability in our schools. Think about all of the efforts that are being made to reduce violence in schools. And what do we see? Substantial continued increase year over year. So if we think about that, and of course, it's very easy for us to think about recent shootings. Tragically, the one several just days ago in Michigan, workplace violence cases we're seeing around the country. we see a very, very consistent and steady increase that is really fueled by people's level of emotional instability. So closing thoughts here, and then on to questions and comments, is that when we think about the human element, people are obviously at the same time, both in organizations, greatest assets and greatest vulnerability. This is the area where it really is the hardest to predict, but it's critically important for us to be operating with the best sort of behavioral assumptions we can make, because really almost the heart of every sort of crisis scenario and risk scenario we encounter are people and people's behavior. Now, since the beginning of 2020 and the onset of the pandemic, we know that there's been really significant increased tension in nearly every domain of behavioral functioning. And we have yet to really see that fully kind of ferment and take its toll. So this is not, again, to be really cast an aura of doom in any way, but it is to say that whatever you could do in your organizations, it's important to understand how these factors are converging and how they will influence the 2020 landscape, and for us to pull together, come out of our silos, and make sure that in your different areas of specialization, we are really drawing on whatever guidance we can get, both inside the organization and outside, that can inform us about these behavioral challenges. It sounds a little grand to say this, but I know that we're coming into an era where the behavioral element in our workplace will be as important or more important than it's really ever been. And we're in a tricky landscape. I hope, and I know that many of you do, that it is a very, very peaceful and stable year, and we start to work our way out of the pandemic and onto greener pastures. But I also know, as a behavioral scientist, that a lot of the consequences of where we've been over the last year will linger and will continue to influence the landscape going forward for the next few years. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn it back to Jocelyn in a moment. And if you do need to reach out to me, please grab a screenshot of this if you'd like, or jot down one of these avenues to communicate. But we'll stay on the line and try to answer some questions and discussions with us while we have everyone together right now. Jocelyn?
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Great presentation. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our attendees did as well. We did have one question from the audience. Do you think that the pandemic brought on latent issues or caused them to develop, or both, one more than the other?
It'd be really hard to parse that out and say which would be more of an influence. I would say yes. What we know is, and let's take this at a really deep kind of behavioral science level for a moment, and then kind of come back to more practical issues. When we think about behavioral issues, especially, for example, mental health issues, the dominant theory that we refer to is called the diathesis stress model. Now, in plain language, it's what we've always referred to as nature and nurture. But we know today, through advances in neuroimaging and neuroscience, that some people are actually born into the world with a higher genetic predisposition to some of these behavioral problems. But they may go their whole lifetime without those really flourishing, without those manifesting, unless they hit the right kind of load of stress. And that's the nurture element, the external factors, and how they combine together. So it's kind of a biopsychosocial model of how all these forces come together. So in one way, the answer would be yes, there can be some people who have these issues in a latent form, and they're just kind of being activated by this stress environment. And there's other people who probably had a very low predisposition, if any, towards some of these behavioral problems, but some of the stresses have been so extreme. I mean, folks, think about this. We've lost 780,000 people in the US alone to COVID over the last 20 months. If there were a pile anywhere of all of the deceased, as we might have in another disaster, it would be mind-blowing to try to envision 780,000 deceased. But because these deaths have happened out of sight, hospitals, homes, ICUs, long-term care facilities, we don't see them. And those statistics, they kind of have a numbing quality for us that we don't get the magnitude in some ways of this. but at some level we do. And for someone who even probably didn't have a high genetic predisposition towards some of these problems, well, when we start to realize that, we've been in an event of this magnitude, it does take its toll. And a lot of people have had direct losses in their homes and families as well. So the stress could be real acute. And even someone with no real tendencies or predisposition to these problems, the level of stress actually can create them from scratch. So it's a little bit of both in terms of this, the answer to this question.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. I think we have time for one more question. So, how do organizations detect when an employee is at risk of acting out due to the different stresses that you've discussed?
Well, there's a few different ways to do this. I mean, at an informal level, we know that detection of these kind of behavioral risks, it works best through three filters. One is a level of self-awareness, and this is where maybe doing workshops or doing educational or awareness level training for employees kind of lets them know both that we're a time of different stress. This is how these stresses, these unique stresses are affecting people. And these are this is how you may experience it. These are the signs and symptoms. And of course, then this is what to do about it, and let people know about available services like employee assistance programs and so forth. So there's that first level. Second level is creating a culture of caring in the organization where we get some element of buddy care. And what I mean by buddy care is when one employee feels enough of a level of trust with others around them to be able to say to a coworker, are you all right? I know you pretty well. I've worked with you for a while. You don't seem like yourself. Are you all right? And can I help? And that's a level of kind of supportive acknowledgement. And maybe another employee picks up on these behavioral indicators and says something to a supervisor or other people to move someone towards help. And the third level of this is kind of at a supervisory level or a management level to be looking out at the whole environment, the levels of stress, how it's affecting people, and making people are getting the right sorts of support and resources to deal with that proactively. That's one bundle of how we may approach this, Jocelyn. But the other would be to make sure that organizations do have good threat assessment team capabilities, good multidisciplinary sorts of teams, that when a behavioral concern arises, that they have a way to assess the severity of it, determine the level of concern, and formulate an effective, threat management capability. And I want to just add one thing to this. This is kind of a heavy note to end the program on, but we have seen over the last years a significant increase in suicides at work. In fact, about an 8% increase year over year in 2020 to 2021 in suicides in the workplace. So when I think about behavioral threats, it's not just someone at risk of, workplace violence. It might be a risk of suicide. It may be a risk as another insider threat of sabotaging the organization because they're angry in some way. So we need to do all of those things somewhat simultaneously. Encourage those three levels or those three filters for detection: self-care, buddy care, supervisory attention, and then have good mechanisms in place for handling these when we do have a situation or a person of concern.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve. Well, thank you so much for those insights, and sadly, we are approaching the end of the session today. But as a reminder to all of our attendees, if we were unable to get to your question, we will be sure to have someone follow up with you directly. Also, this session was being recorded, so be on the lookout for the on-demand video. If you'd like to learn more about how critical event management platforms can help with the incidents that Steve spoke about today, be sure to visit www.everbridge.com. And with that, I want to give a big thank you to Steve Cremando, and thank you to our audience for taking the time out of your busy day to join us. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Have a great day.